Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Alex Patterson. I am the Executive Director of Canada 2020. And it's a pleasure to see you all today joining us for our Indigenous Economic Reconciliation Forum 2020. This is an event that we have hosted for going on, I think, 5-6 years now. Last year, obviously, we had a different looking event. We were able to meet in person, but we're really happy to be convening a really crucial conversation again this year. Before I get into the why we're here, I'd like to acknowledge that where I'm broadcasting from the traditional territory of the Algonquin and the Anishinaabe people. We have a really packed program today. Helping us make this program possible, first and foremost, is Canada 2020's sustaining partners. These are the organizations that help us do what we do, and they have stuck with us through a very turbulent year, and we really appreciate their support. I would also like to single out two companies, Rio Tinto and Enbridge, for their specific support for this program. We really appreciate their wanting to see programs and conversations like this take place. Quick sort of level set of where we're at. So this series that we've been doing, From Crisis to Resilience, we've been very busy and we've been hosting conversations. We started with Christine Elliott, the Deputy Premier of Ontario, and we have covered the gambit from conversations on connectivity infrastructure, green infrastructure with Minister McKenna, small business supports with Minister Ng. Today we're here talking about Indigenous economic reconciliation, and we will be doing some more work next week on energy. But if you want to catch up and you want to sort of engage in some of the work that we've been doing, you can do that. You can go to our YouTube channel at Canada 2020. You can look at our Facebook Live, Canada 2020. And if you like listening to stuff like I do, you can search for the 2020 Network on your favorite podcast app. So today, as I mentioned, we're very excited about keeping this conversation moving, and there's a lot of active dialogue happening right now. Our moderator today, Tabitha Ball, has a really fantastic article in the Globe and Mail a couple of days ago that I encourage everyone to read. I know our comms team is sharing that out, and I think it's a nice level set for what we want to talk about today, which is that we are obviously in a moment of real crisis, but if we are not intentional, and if we are not concerted in our efforts, Indigenous communities, businesses, entrepreneurs, and people will have a harder road to climb out of the moment that we are in. And so we want to spend today diving into what success looks like, some novel approaches, some new ideas that are helping to shape this conversation. Quick agenda overview at 10. So we're a couple minutes behind, but we have a fantastic conversation to kick us off here with the Honorable Mark Miller, Minister of Indigenous Services. And like I said, Tabitha Ball, she's the President and CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. We'll get to them in a second. Afterwards, we have a conversation with Damadabi Leach, who is the Director of Governance and Sorry, that's a typo. She is at Wabatek, which is a group and an initiative that was launched actually at our event last year, her Center of Excellence. So Dawn is going to be with us, as is Clayton Walker, who's the President and CEO of the Iron Ore Company of Canada, as is Tanis Peterson, the Executive Director of the Chouetin Railway. So looking forward to talking to them. Afterwards, we're going to be checking in with Crystal Smith, the Chief Counsellor of the Haisla Nation, as well as Susanna Pierce, the Director of Corporate Affairs for LNG Canada, on the LNG project and development on the West Coast. And then finally, we're going to be talking about major projects and Indigenous participation in major projects in Canada. Neil Edwards, the Executive Director of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, will be with us, as will Brian McGuigan, Manager of the Aboriginal Policy at Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. Bing Giroux at Sedgwick Consulting, and will be moderated by our good friend Sahir Khan at the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy. If you want to engage with the platform today, you can do that using if you're watching on Zoom, use the Zoom Q&A function. I will be going through and sending questions to our moderators. Or if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, use the live chat. Our team is there as well. we will be concluding next week with this series with an event with Minister O'Regan. So I'll briefly plug that. And I will now hand things off to Tabitha. Tabitha, I will give you the floor. Thank you very much for leading the conversation today.
Thank you, Alex. So Ani, Tabitha Indigenous Cause, Nipsing Indigenous. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for being here. My name is Tabitha, as Alex said. I won't go into my background too much because I really want to dive into this conversation, but I want to say thank you to you, Alex, and to Canada 2020 for this platform today. It's not lost on me that an organization like Canada 2020 would dedicate this much time to talking about economic reconciliation, and something that, of course, at CCAB we're pushing, but a lot of our friends here on the call and also in our discussions with Minister Miller. So I wanted to jump into the conversation. I'm really looking forward to this discussion this morning. Minister Miller, thank you for being here.
Pleasure to be here.
I was reflecting back on the last time that you and I had a real discussion, and that was back in your office at the end of February. It was a snowy day in Ottawa that day as well. And I really want to say Chimigwech for the time that you took. It was a busy time for you. At that time, for sure, there was another economic disruption happening. I don't know that any of us thought that we would be here 10 months from now. So I just wanted to ask if you could reflect a little bit on the past 10 months and what you've seen happening and the role government's played in economic reconciliation with Indigenous business and communities.
Well, look, thanks, Tabitha, and thanks for leading this important conversation. I'd highlight, as much like Alex, I am in coming to you from the traditional territory of the Algonquin people here in Ottawa today. I would actually go 3 months back to when I was named minister, and I'm reflecting on this year that's gone by at times really, really slowly and at times really, really quickly. And if someone had asked me if what my ambition was a year out, and I had said my ambition is to keep people healthy, safe, and alive, they would have looked at me as if I was the most unambitious person that's ever been named to the post, to any position as a cabinet minister. And yet here we are today in the middle of a global pandemic. And when we last spoke in February, we were in the midst of some really challenging times that, with respect to the solidarity movement that was affecting the entire economy, not knowing the pandemic that was to come. And we had a very interesting conversation on some of the economic tools that, as part of the government's commitment, we were and we still are committed to bring to bear to ensure that we start closing those socioeconomic gaps that are the main aspects of my mandate, and really a source of continuing inequality in this country. And if anything, COVID has shown, it's really exacerbated, for example, the crisis in housing that in some communities it creates up to 50% of housing insecurity, issues that of clean and safe water, challenges with respect to land recognition, all these issues that really underpin the topics that we're talking about today, which is economic reconciliation. And they're really the cornerstones of safety and security that we have to continue on even through a pandemic. And while today Indigenous communities are getting hit very hard by a second wave, and we're really deploying all resources, including options with respect to the military, to make sure that even the most northern and remote communities are being kept safe, and we're reacting in lightning quick time with respect to a virus that moves quicker than us. It is really something that my mind keeps focusing on, and I'm sure this conversation will continue into some of the supports that the government has brought to bear in order to try and address some of the gaps that exist with respect to some of the economic inequities that exist with respect to Indigenous peoples. And I would point to some of the measures that were put in place that are wide in scope. And they were really measures asking the Canadian government to do something that's not particularly good at, which is to replace really what is a private function of generating wealth in the economy. And so they were very, very broad in scope. But what we saw right away was that in some ways, they affected directly Indigenous communities insofar as when you talk about band-owned businesses, they weren't eligible initially. We had to make a fix. when you talk about special supports and access to capital and supports, whether it's grants, loans, forgivable loans, and equity, really ones that Indigenous businesses, most often smaller businesses than large, but there's a very important conversation here about access to large capital that will be very important for, I think, the people watching today. What we saw was those inequities come to the fore. So quickly, we deployed capital, and I think we can talk about that in subsequent questions, to ensure that we were moving to address that unequal access to capital and grants that are so important in supporting businesses generally, but much more so during a global pandemic.
Yeah, and I did want to talk about that. And as you know, we've done a lot of work on a lot of those programs that were rolled out, and very pleased to see the response happen when those inequities came to the forefront. I guess the question I'm kind of struggling with, and I know I'm taking a bit of an advantage of your time here, but you know, in the speech from the throne, there were so many really incredible commitments made from the government with respect to closing those gaps, socioeconomic gaps with respect to water and Truth and Reconciliation Commission and missing and murdered Indigenous women. But what I found was a bit missing was that discussion about economic prosperity. You know, we definitely need to close those gaps for Indigenous people in this country and right the wrongs of history. And I know that you're very committed to that. But how do we also ensure that we're continuing to have that economic prosperity discussion, and not just with your ministry, but across all of government? And that's something that we definitely found as programs were rolled out, that it took us to have to flag those with your ministry for them to be remedied. Where we really want to see these programs rolled out with the thought across all ministries about how does that affect Indigenous people and businesses.
Yeah, and it's an exceedingly important point, Tabitha, and really voices like yours are key to identifying those so that we can move quickly to address them. It's important to, in my mind, to take a step back as to what that speech from the throne was supposed to do and what it wasn't supposed to do. I don't think my reflections on this will at all be a criticism of your point, because I think it's an exceedingly valid one that we should be talking about and be capable to be moving on, even in the midst of a global pandemic. But the speech from the throne, which feels like it was a year ago, but was only about 2 months, was really a reaffirmation of what was said in the speech from the throne from the year prior, which included these important aspects, as well as those contained in various mandate letters. And I think we'll talk about procurement after that and some of the challenges that we face, even in procurement during COVID, for COVID-related, for example, PPE or other measures that are being deployed to keep people safe. But the speech from the throne, that was like 2 months ago, was really directed to Canadians and Indigenous peoples living in Canada to say, we will have your back. We will have your back to keep you safe, and we will deploy the resources necessary to make sure that you are safe through the course of this pandemic, the course of which we haven't entirely traced, obviously, and we still don't know, despite the fact that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, still a heck of a lot of tunnel left. And the fall economic statement put teeth to that. It also was an opportunity to address a number of issues that COVID has brought to the fore, particularly some of those inequities, and I would name it among those the closing of the infrastructure gap, particularly in housing, which is, I think, in people's minds was a livability issue prior to that. But what we obviously realize is that it's also a massive health issue, particularly if you look at the way COVID spreads, particularly if you look at the way tuberculosis spreads, particularly among the Inuit. But First Nations are not exempt from that, or Métis either. There's 60 times in some First Nations communities than in non-Indigenous communities, 300 times in Inuit communities. That's an issue of housing, and people, I guess it's hard for a lot of people to grasp that. So that was one of the examples. There are, and then again, the speech from the throne reiterated what was said in the speech prior. It was only a year prior. Sometimes, most of the time, they're 4 years apart. But it is an exceedingly valid point, because I think what we're seeing is every time I engage with leadership, every time I engage with prominent business proponents and leaders, they say to us, you know, there is this pandemic, that's the priority, but we need to be able to move forward on another number of those key issues. For me, it's ensuring those infrastructure builds of an essential nature can continue. We've talked in the last week a lot about water builds and the recommitment to that. We've talked about roads. building that capacity within the community, keeping people safe, but also deploying the economic instruments that I mentioned earlier a few minutes ago. And if you recall, in April, we announced about $307 million for specifically targeted towards Indigenous businesses through NACA. I think 240 has been directed towards business owners, but those are measures that we continue to signal and continue to show our commitment to just keeping Indigenous businesses healthy during this pandemic. Procurement's a huge issue. That 5% commitment for me is about the government of Canada putting its money where its mouth is, and it's been, as you know, it's been uneven across departments. You could look at defense, you could look at Indigenous services, you could look at procurement. They fluctuate, and you can't sort of have this sort of compartmentalizations of Indigenous business. It's got to be across the spectrum. So as part of that is a longer term approach to ensure that within government, we're telling each other, like, hey, you got to start investing and committing to these Indigenous businesses. And for that, it's been imperfect and uneven, and we need sort of mechanisms like navigators that I think you've been a proponent of to ensure that community. It's hard for any person to go in to go into the government of Canada's suite of resources that exist and say, hey, that thing's for me. There's always help needed. I would say even more so when you're a business owner that's been historically and not so, and in the more recent past, not been able to have that access to capital for a number of reasons, including racism, systemic racism. Those are also issues that were touched upon in the speech from the throne that we need to address to ensure that we're moving forward on that level playing field that it still isn't level. So I know you'll have follow-up questions for that, and I'll stop yammering, but I make no excuse for what goes on in speeches from the throne, but I think the context is very important.
No, that is helpful. Yeah, I think so. I want to touch first on the economic recovery and infrastructure spend commitments. I think those were definitely welcome, and we've talked a lot about that as well, about the impact on Indigenous businesses who had to move to work from home, or Indigenous business people who've had to move to work from home, both from broadband, from overhousing conditions, as you discussed. As we look towards economic recovery and that investment in infrastructure and community, how do we ensure that Indigenous businesses and Indigenous people have an opportunity to be part of that recovery, so that they have a part to build the new homes within communities, and that they have a part to do maintenance on new schools and infrastructure? And I think there's a real opportunity there for us to ensure that we're growing that economy, particularly within communities when we're growing that infrastructure, repairing that infrastructure. So just your thoughts on how we can ensure that happens.
It's by trusting those on the ground. I'm reflecting on the impact of what the best resources and how they were deployed during COVID in record time for key health outcomes, and what we've seen clearly, consistency, and measurably when we've looked at the health response to a health problem. And by analogy, I would say this is no different for business, is that when you trust people on the ground and when you give them the financial resources necessary to deploy their genius, it works. And we've seen that throughout the pandemic response. Those that trust their health authorities locally, Indigenous-led pandemic response teams, they're all working, they're all Indigenous, they're all working exceedingly well for their people, and they know that that those solutions that are sort of come from on high get much less paid attention to than local leaders, local leadership, elders, innovators, people, trusted sources. So too for business. The way we, and a particularly pointed example of that is some of the challenges we're facing on some of the water infrastructure and lifting long-term water advisories. One of the repeated criticisms that I've been hearing from leadership is that they wanted us to be with them for the long term and not simply after spring 2021. So a lot of the announcement we made last week are amounts to stabilize the way critical essential services delivered, and that goes by training people on the ground, ensuring that that skill is deployed and lifted up, so that those people that are pride of their community in some sense, working in a state-of-the-art plant, suddenly don't get a better offer from another community, which is more often than not non-Indigenous. And that was one of the polls that we had. For example, while meeting the long-term water advisory, wasn't part of the long-term plan and partnership. That's no different in business. It's no different in larger infrastructure builds. For example, seeing how the infrastructure bank can deploy larger capital into communities, northern or remote communities, and not saying to yourself, oh, that's northern and remote, therefore we're not, or smaller, therefore we're not going to invest in it because X, Y, or Z. I mean, that's often a proxy for saying we're not going to work with Indigenous peoples. And then there's a second aspect to what you're talking about, and I'd like to hear your ideas on this as well, is how you deploy Indigenous capital, Indigenous brilliance, and business savvy across all of Canadian society. And that's an aspect that goes far and above any sort of capacity that Indigenous Services Canada has, for example, and even perhaps less so the Government of Canada. But those are initiatives that we have to sort of lift up within Canadian society to ensure that that Indigenous businesses have that access to capital, access to equity, have that traction that is rightfully theirs. And so that's a reflection I haven't really perfected my thoughts on, but it's an important aspect of this discussion.
Yeah, I think, part of that we've seen in some of the work that we're doing, this will kind of lead us to the procurement discussion, is how does government, in moving towards the 5%, incent partnerships, so incent corporate Canada to ensure that they're also working with Indigenous business, to start to ensure that they are across Canada, as you said, really valuing that capacity within Indigenous leaders and Indigenous businesses. And we've done some work that I think will be coming to your table or your desk shortly on how to get to the 5% we can and how the government can incent that tier 2, tier 3 purchase from Indigenous businesses. So I think that's a real important component of that 5%. I know we've had some discussions with Dawn, who will be talking later, and our friends at NACA and CANDO, continually to work towards this 5% policy. But maybe, you could just talk a little bit about where you see that process going, on how we're getting to the 5%, and some of the levers that you think are going to be really important to ensure it is a cross-government commitment.
Well, one of the first things that I need to do is keep nagging my colleagues in cabinet, and because it falls under their responsibilities. And when I say put the capital of the Government of Canada where its mouth is, it's a serious commitment, and that's part of my task. It falls as well on Minister Anita Anand, who has the lead on this. Very eager to work hard and make this commitment a success. We're not there yet. But we're certainly working on it. I recently had a sit down with her and the President of the Treasury Board, Jean-Yves Duclos, to ensure that we were doing this in the right way and making sure that we had Indigenous voices, Indigenous contribution. In fact, your navigator solution came up. So happy to hear it. It absolutely does not fall on deaf ears. But these are all, and we have Indigenous voices around the table as well. And that is key to ensuring that we're not sort of having this edict that we've all kind of come up with together in the room, and then it just doesn't work on the ground. We have to make it stick, and it's got to cut across. It's got to cut across departments. There is often a default approach to take sort of a pan-Indigenous approach to things, and that is something that does get criticized, because we have to realize that there are economic realities in different regions of Canada where there might be a disproportionate balance that just doesn't work, but it should not be an excuse for more movement. I certainly don't see I think we've got to get in people's minds that 5% is a floor and not a ceiling, and that will take persistent commitment from people all in cabinet and all the way down and throughout the civil service. It's one of my reflections as well as our civil service is independent. It's a cornerstone of a pluralistic democracy. Very key to that, but making sure that that muscle memory happens and gets ingrained in the civil service is key for this being a success. I could be out of this job tomorrow, but those highly trained, skilled civil servants in Indigenous Services Canada, a great number of them are Indigenous, making a lot of sacrifices to work in a department that gets heavily criticized, are working to make a difference for their own peoples. We have to make sure those reflexes cut across those governmental silos.
Yeah, I think it's a great point too, and I know we've talked about this too, just about the cultural awareness training and training across government, particularly in procurement. I know some of the barriers we've kind of heard is just the procurement officers and talking to Indigenous businesses. I think there's an opportunity there for us to really ensure that they understand the barriers that Indigenous based businesses are facing, and something we'll be speaking to about as well. But just to say, as you said, you know, it is about across government and people who are making those real connections and contacts to Indigenous business, and how do we ensure they understand the barriers and, you know, just particularly like why they may not have had a successful federal contract in the past, because that is definitely a key issue right now that Indigenous businesses are facing and looking at procurement. And I think that's just the one, you know, I think there is great work being done on getting to the 5%. I think it's really important that we remember that there are close to 60,000 Indigenous businesses in Canada today that could also be accessing federal contracts in advance of us getting to the policy of the 5%. So we need to be able to, you know, keep working on that today as well. I think I wanted to, there's a question in the chat, so maybe I'll ask that, and then if, of course, I'll have others, or if not. So this is a question from Heather at Indigenous Resource Network. We've seen a lot of big Indigenous business deals in the past few months, such as buying 50% of Clearwater Seafood, and a Cree Coalition Natural Law Energy securing up to $1 billion stake in Keystone XL. First Nation Major Projects Coalition and the AIOC are providing financial support for even more First Nation owned and led projects. Do you think Indigenous nations should be involved as partners and proponents in resource projects on their territory? And what is your government doing to support these kind of equity opportunities?
That is an excellent question, and I will do my darndest to give an excellent answer to it. I think there's and this is something that I think is interesting about how we see the slow progress, and sometimes it kind of hits us that yes, there has been progress, despite some of the really distressing things we see in the news, particularly in and around some of the unacceptable violence in the fisheries with respect to the Mi'kmaq, and their constitutional right for moderate livelihood, and that is, while that is an ongoing discussion, and it, you know, it's a reflection on us that people have to go to court to perfect rights that are theirs inherently or through treaty. But my reflection on the Clearwater deal was that this was an opportunity for 50-50 joint venture with the Mi'kmaq to pursue a livelihood that is actually exceedingly lucrative, while difficult, obviously, because fishing is very difficult, dangerous. But this is an opportunity to thrive and go into an area that has historically been excluded to them. Clearwater is a very lucrative company. It has, I guess, a sort of exclusive fishing zone, and it's a real difference maker in the Atlantic. And these are Indigenous communities or a consortium that will be given the opportunity to thrive, and that's, I think it's heartwarming. It goes into the mention I made earlier about access to big capital, and I sincerely hope this transaction goes through, because I think it's a symbol of where we've come as a country. While we do acknowledge that there's a whole heck of a lot more to do. You look at the Grand Chief of the Cree Nation, whose words in Quebec resonate quite strongly. That you know, here they are, you know, driving the bus, and they're in charge, and that's something that has been rarely afforded to Indigenous peoples across Canada. Another aspect to this is the reason for doing it, and we'll talk about Canada's obligation, is because courts are saying so, UNDRIP is saying so, and we're catching up to those judgments. They're catching up with us, and it's affecting business to the extent that if you're not engaging in the right way with Indigenous communities and addressing their rights, you can't effectively deploy your capital in the project that you want to do. And often you'll find partners that that are willing to do it. And one shouldn't presume that Indigenous communities all think alike and that there isn't a difference of opinion within communities. There's sometimes a tendency to think that way. It's not the case. There's difference of opinion, but there's also great consensus building skills and great capital that's remained undeployed. And that includes large investments. That includes involvement in the resource and extraction industry that, while controversial in many circles, is one of the largest employer of Indigenous peoples in Canada. And Minister O'Regan underlines that often when we talk about working to achieve informed consent, which is a cornerstone of Canadian law. And that's something that we need to reflect upon and help foster consensus building in the right way, deploy the capital necessary to support the innovation that is already out there. I would say to you that we're not there yet, but very conscious of it and working hard to support capital in its ability to be deployed by Indigenous peoples. That involves something I mentioned earlier as well, which is some of the weight that can be brought to bear of the Canadian Infrastructure Bank.
Yeah, I think we've definitely seen, Chief Terry Paul won our Aboriginal Lifetime Achievement Award last year, and he's definitely been a real leader. And I think so important too is his ability and desire to help share his learnings with other communities. So I'm hopeful for the Clearwater deal as well. I think that also kind of one of the discussions we kind of had just about and also the Clearwater deal is just this opportunity that it also provides to, I just came from a discussion with Minister Baines on the 50-30 challenge. So how do we increase the number of women and Indigenous people and underrepresented people on boards and at executive leadership? And so much of that discussion is about how did the youth see Indigenous leaders in those positions. And I guess maybe just some of the things we were discussing this morning is, how do we ensure that we're increasing that employment, but also how are we holding up the youth to ensure that they have the education and the results and resources to get to those new positions. And then we can ensure that we're promoting within organizations also to the higher levels. So it's just a question on the 50-30 and where do you think the role is that, and what do you think we also need to do in order to ensure that we have the youth and the youth there seeing those potential positions for them, and what's the government thinking they can do to support that role?
These are all exceedingly important questions, but it's one that's top of mind based on recent discussions I've had in and around education and continuing the supports through primary, secondary, but also post-secondary education. And I think what we've seen throughout this pandemic is the importance to support Indigenous students that are facing some really, really challenging times in their post-secondary education. It's why early on we deployed about $75 million directed over and above all those instruments that were available for everyone else, but targeted supports to Indigenous students that are struggling in their post-secondary education. And then more recently, based on the demands of an area that is really needs more space to flourish, which is some of the post-secondary education on reserve. Often people faced with the choice will obviously have to go off reserve to do their post-secondary education. There's some really brilliant institutions that are flourishing across Canada. And as we move to decolonize post-secondary education, part of that discussion is ensuring that in community resources are supported. So recent announcements in and around supporting post-secondary education on reserve are key to this discussion. Just in the general theme and importance of supporting those students who are just, you got the grades, you should be able to go and just really allow people in that 20 or 18 to 30 segment to flourish. It's a very distressing time for them, and this is going to be a difficult winter. And these are challenges that are very, very much present, but they're so important for the future. Based on things that Paul Martin says often, which is this is just a demographic that is that we can't fail, and too often we have failed, and that goes first and foremost through allowing those tools to be there, and then ensuring that access to micro capital to make sure that innovation and ingenuity gets deployed is key. That falls largely under, as you mentioned, Minister Baines, but they're all elements of this important puzzle in ensuring that we don't fail yet another generation.
Thank you. Yeah, I know ESDC is, and there was a question about this kind of came in at the same time as I was asking about ESDC's goal about developing the national training plan. And are there going to be levers, or how do we ensure that there's training for Indigenous people included in this plan? So we've actually just done some work with ESDC on looking at the Indigenous people that have been trained through that plan. And I know, just for the audience, ESDC is working with Indigenous Works on some programs of ensuring Indigenous students have opportunities to be employed. Just your thoughts on if there are specific carve-outs within the ESDC training program for Indigenous youth, and if it's something that you think we might be able to advocate for.
I'm certainly willing to bug my colleague in order to do so. It's one of my particular personality traits, but I think there should be. I'm not familiar with it. I think there should be. I mean, we've been pushing, and this is again part of the greater conversation that we have at Cabinet, is ensuring that you have a number of portfolios that are primarily Indigenous in nature. Mine, Minister Bennett's, and Minister Van Dal to a large extent, but it has to be a whole of Cabinet approach, and that includes Anita Nand, who's passionate about these issues as well, and Minister Baines, and they're aware of it. I'm just not as familiar with those instruments as I perhaps should be, but glad to push.
Yeah, no, I think, it's just something that we've found too, just in, I mean, it's a lot to put on just on your ministry and Minister Bennett's for everything that's Indigenous, where, and I know we've talked about this before, but really, like, it needs to be every ministry looking at how does this work for Indigenous people, and not continually coming back. So I don't think that these are all things that you should be definitely inserting in, but just trying to understand how from here we can better influence within the other ministries. So thank you for that. I guess, just to give you an opportunity to think about potential options or opportunities. And, I completely understand that right now your main priority is ensuring that we get vaccine rollout and PPE and keep people safe and ensure that communities can open again. But if you look beyond that, if we weren't where we are a year ago, what would you have said that your goals were and what you were hoping for? Not to be on the spot at all.
No, I mean, look, there were some key mandate elements in my letter that I take very seriously. One of the challenges I have when I get a little bit of free time is to ensure that we keep pushing those. I think people have seen our ability that, while perhaps disappointed with unfortunate deadline pushes, that we're recommitting to Indigenous peoples. Often, and I found this through learning, and I didn't expect the gap to be so wide, is that there's an understandable lack of trust by Indigenous peoples, most level towards the Canadian government, other levels of government for that matter. And that constantly has to be built and nurtured. And that comes through contact, through relationship building, comes through demonstrating real promise as opposed to simply making promises. And that, I think, is some of the issues that get raised very, very often throughout this pandemic. Well, very real. People want to see a recommitment to closing closing the socioeconomic gaps. I would note on that we do talk about socioeconomic gaps, and it's very important to note the massive investments that this government's put in. National Chief Bellegarde likes to say it's 5 times the committed amount by the Kelowna Accords, but they have contributed to closing the gaps that separate Indigenous peoples from non-Indigenous peoples. The UN recently released a report that showed a closing, showed a closing of that gap. Canada dropping a tiny bit, and Indigenous communities moving up, but there's still a noted gap between communities, Indigenous peoples living off reserve and on reserve, and that's work that is continuous. It has made it such that Indigenous communities are more vulnerable to COVID, and there's nothing magic that has been done to sort of help with Indigenous communities fighting COVID. It's come through a tremendous amount of effort that has taken a very sort of truthful acknowledgement of those gaps and how we work to overcome them. Those still remain. We're working to address them, and they need to be addressed in a multifaceted way, including full active participation of Indigenous business, Indigenous peoples in the economy. Yes, through those very important pillars that I mentioned, but also through better access to capital, better support, better integration, better awareness throughout society. And I think this is where we do a less of a good job of some of the ingenuity and real brilliance that is out there that has been historically underappreciated and discriminated against. And those are, those are things that we see every day, and we have to continue to work in many, many ways, including lifting up your advocacy and making sure that there is economic reconciliation. You see flashes of hope, and we mentioned the Clearwater deal. There are many others, but there are also many pitfalls along the way. It's my challenge these days is making sure that we don't let that type of thinking that has consumed us in the past consume us as we try to deploy in record time a vaccine in a way that reflects what our healthcare system is, that is underserved Indigenous communities, and is one of universality, but it has as its underpinning a basis in fairness that recognizes that vulnerable people need to be addressed. And this, I know you didn't want to be talking about COVID, but I have to conclude on this point because we are still in the midst of it. But my challenge on a daily basis is ensuring that Indigenous peoples are properly served. The reminder is in my title, but it's also a reminder of everything I see during the day. So I end on saying that I am hopeful, despite the next couple months, 2-3 months being most likely very, very, very difficult. But I believe coming out of this, and as we talk about the stimulus, and it's important, it's an important loop back to the fall economic statement, as the Minister of Finance indicated, when it is right to do so, to invest a couple points of percentage points into our GDP into stimulus, and this absolutely has to include economic reconciliation.
Yes, thank you. I completely agree. Happy to do what we can to support that. So I think we're getting to time. I really want to thank you for your candid conversation today, as always, and really, for taking the time to be here when I understand that, the health of our people is so important and a priority. So want to ensure that you're able to continue to focus on that. But it's always, good for all of us to continue to look forward at how we can recover in an inclusive way and regrow Canada, including all of us. So Miigwech, thank you so much for being here. It was really a pleasure to chat with you again.
Mr. Miller, thank you very much. Tabitha, thank you. Miigwech, really appreciate the opportunity to hear from you both today, and I'll let you jump off the stream. Mr. Miller, you've got a busy day. Tabitha, I know you do as well. Other panels to get to, other conversations to be had. So thank you very much. And I will now bring in our next panel. So as I mentioned off the top, we have some returning guests to this forum this year. We have the good pleasure of being joined now by Dawn Madabi-Leach, who is with the Center of Excellence for Indigenous Minerals Development, and she's also the Vice Chair of the National Indigenous Economic Development Board. Clayton Walker is also with us. He's the President and CEO of the Iron Ore Company of Canada. And we have Tanis Peterson, who's the Executive Director of the Schwettin Railway. I want to thank you all very much for joining me today. And I think a quick bit of context here, and Dawn, I'll go to you very shortly for some opening remarks, but it has been over a year since the launch of the Center of Excellence for Indigenous Minerals Development. That happened last year at this event in Ottawa at the Westin, overlooking downtown Ottawa. It was a great event. It was a great launch. It's been a bit of a year, obviously, since that launch. And I want to go around for some introductory remarks, but I'm going to start with you, Dawn. Perhaps you can sort of catch us up to speed on what's happened since and provide us a bit of context for our conversation today. So Dawn, welcome.
Oh, Miigwech, Ani Boju, Bidabin Dishnakas, Jijak Dodem, Nidom Nasing Mina, Wigwaskinaga, Donjaba. Good morning, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Dawn Madabi Leach, and I'm the Vice Chair of the National Indigenous Economic Development Board and the Manager of the Wabatek Business Development, as well as I guess, a founder of the Center of Excellence for Indigenous Minerals Development. So I'm honored to be here with you today to share some of the national initiatives to assist Indigenous people, industry, and government to involve Indigenous people in Canada's economy in a more meaningful and profound way. These initiatives are about having Indigenous people being part of the solution and all decisions affecting us. One of the initiatives is the Center of Excellence for Indigenous Minerals Development, which is an entity to share leading practices, case studies, templates, research, expert referrals, and generally act as an information clearinghouse with respect to the mining sector. As mentioned, because of COVID, things have been a little bit slow, but we've been working on all of the work behind the scenes, the database, getting the information together for the supply of these services. So the center is a partnership that involves the First Nations, the Government of Canada, and industry. So at this point in time, the government partners are FedNor and Natural Resources Canada. Our industry partner is Rio Tinto, who have provided significant financial support, as well as open doors for us in the industry. I just want to mention we welcome other industry partners to join in this exciting partnership as well. So please don't hesitate to let me know of your interest. The center is the type of initiative that builds Indigenous capacity. It includes an Indigenous lens on industry matters and can be replicated in many sectors. Creating Indigenous institutional capacity helps to create new networks and bridge understanding that brings perspective, traditional knowledge, and significant value to economic development that is otherwise missed. So I look forward to exploring this a little further with you as we delve into this conversation in a deeper way. Miigwech.
Miigwech, thank you very much, Dawn. Clayton, I'm going to go to you next because I saw you smiling and nodding, particularly when Dawn was talking about corporate partners and getting involved. So Clayton, I'll bring you in here. If you could share some opening thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And look, it's a pleasure to be with all of you today, and really honored to be here with Dawn and Tanis to talk about these opportunities and how we create partnerships. I thought just a minute just to let people know who Iron Ore Company of Canada is we actually produce high-grade iron ore pellets and concentrate, which is sold globally and is used to produce steel, high-quality steel around the world. To do that, we have 5 mines or pits located in Labrador. We have a concentrator and a pellet plant. We then have a 418-kilometer railway that links those operations with our deep sea port down in Sept-Îles. And to make all that happen, we employ around 2,600 people and create about 6,000 indirect and direct jobs in that region to make all that work. So that's kind of who we are and how that works. And in order to do that, though, there's 5 different Indigenous groups that we interact with in that area that we do. And a key to making us successful is also how we interact and build those partnerships with them. And I hopefully will get a chance to share some of my ideas on how to make those things work.
Thanks very much, Clayton. Tanis, some opening thoughts yourself. Tanis Peterson.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Alex and Canada 2020 for putting this on. For starters, well, I think that for me, the star is the company that I'm working with now. So I'm going to start with that instead of focusing on what I've done. Triton is a federally regulated railway that's operating in northern Quebec and Newfoundland. I joined them. I had the privilege of joining them this year, but their journey actually has started over 15 years ago. We are celebrating currently the 15th anniversary of the company, so we're very, very proud of that. In fact, even though 15 years is not a long time ago, I think it's a sign that you know there was innovative thinking by the communities who own the railway and the drive. Because I can tell you from my experience, railway is not necessarily an easy business to get into. So never mind those conditions. Yes, so it actually was a historical first. The railway was the first Indigenous owned railway in Canada. And that was with the Inuit communities of Washat Maniutam and Manimakush Lac John, as well as the Naskapi Nation. So we do passenger train service, freight service, as well as we do transport some iron ore from I guess it would be competitor of Clayton, down on our track. We own 215-ish kilometers from Emerald, Labrador, which is not too far from Wabush, Labrador City area, up until Shefferville. We offer the passenger service actually from Sept-Îles up to Shefferville. And that's through actually a contract of, we use the QNSNL rail line on that first portion, and that's the owned by IOC, their railway.
Well, thank you very much. That's good context, I think, for the rest of the conversation today. I think where I want to go next is kind of the crux of a lot of the conversations that we're going to be having today. And I think what we're trying to get at through the events that we have done here at Canada 2020, which is really trying to analyze like what makes economic partnerships between industry and Indigenous communities successful, right? Because if we can get at that, I mean, there's obviously tremendous learning that we can extrapolate outwards and carry forwards. So Clayton, why don't I start with you? What do you think makes a successful partnership?
Thanks, Alex. Look, I think it's a big question, right? Is how do you make all of this stuff happen? And when I think about it, it really comes down to two things. And it's commitment and trust, and I'll explain that in a minute. If you think about how do you get to there, it's a long road, and I think you first start off with IBAs or agreements, and I'm proud to say at IOC we've now have agreements with 4 of the 5 groups that we interact with, and those don't just happen, and that's where that commitment comes in. You have to have a desire to make it work, and look, a lot of work. I was really pleased. Just 2 weeks ago, we signed our agreement with MLJ and ITUM, and years in the making, and it goes and comes, right? But you have to stay committed to that process. But all an IBA does is it gives you a framework. In order to bring it to life, I think the secret sauce is all around how do you build trust between the 2 parties or 3 parties or 4 parties, however many you have. You have to build the trust, and it comes back to building that. And so first you're going to be committed because you're starting from different points. You're going to have different views, different goals. So you got to be committed to going through that process. And then the next piece is you got to take the time to listen. I like to tell my team, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and you need to use them appropriately. And so by listening, we're able to understand what each other value or doesn't value, and how can we help kind of bridge that gap. What do we bring? What don't we bring? How can we help each other learn? And as we listen and gain that understanding, we start to form a foundation of trust. And once we built that trust, then it gets a lot easier to help bring that economic value to life. And look, you don't have to have an IBA to do that. to build that trust. All the IBA does is give you that structure to help you make it more feasible to get that done. I think of some examples, as we recently worked on a project with the NASCAP on bringing broadband into the local community, which now that COVID's happened has been a really big win for that local community to have access. They were able to use the infrastructure along the railway that we use to help bring the broadband in, and it was really just a win-win. But it's because we were in talks and conversations and understanding what were their needs, what could we do. We can't build or buy everything, but we can use some of our stuff to help make theirs work. And it's that partnership based on those conversations that made that happen. And I'm sure Tanis will talk about it, but the Schuylkill Railway is another great example of a partnership that's working, that's based on trust. You have to stay committed. Everyone's got their views and what they want. But if you're committed to it and you trust each other, that's what opens up the real economic value that these different partnerships can bring. So I think that would be my quick summary on how you actually bring the value out of those agreements, Alex.
A good quick summary too, as you mentioned, a complex process, right? And I'm mindful that was something that National Chief Perry Bellegarde has said on our stage, and I'm sure we've all heard him say it many times: before you build anything, build a relationship. So I think that fits really nicely into that. Tanis, Clayton referenced you and your work. Let's go to you. What do you think makes a successful partnership?
Well, a successful partnership. First, actually, I'll probably talk about the infrastructure piece, because we have, being an Indigenous owned railway, we do have a little bit of a different aspect. We can have a direct impact in the communities for employment. We have a direct impact to prioritize Indigenous owned local businesses when possible. So the infrastructure is really core to, we all know this, that it's core to any business development, period. And in our case, with the rail infrastructure, it's not only a core piece of the economic development for the area, but it is essential service. It's not even a want to be. I'm not sure if people are aware, there's only two means of transport up to Schefferville. One is by air and one is by rail. There are no roads. So if we're looking at, essential food for people, medicine, all sorts of supplies, this is all brought up by railway. And then we add on to the fact that literally probably every single business that does operate or offer services to the Schefferville area will have to ship up their supplies and their merchandise with the railway, including even the competitor mine that we were talking about for large machines, machineries to keep their mines open, which is also has an impact on the economy. So there are many different levels of partnerships that have to be maintained in that environment. And even our partnership with the environment, throwing that in there. I know it's not the topic of the day, but just kind of plugging it. Rail is the most environmentally friendly means of transport. So just throw that in.
That's a good throw, and I'll allow it. I'll allow it. Dawn, let's go to you. I mean, I think you've obviously got your own thoughts on this, but also feel free to build on a lot of the great points that Clayton and Tanis have made. What's key to a good partnership?
Well, I think another path to forge economic partnerships is through procurement. One of the other national initiatives that I've been working on with people like Tabitha Bull at the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business is the development of a national database of Indigenous businesses from every economic sector across every region in Canada. So we're really interested in a model similar to the one that exists in Australia, known as Supply Nation. They've been very successful in procuring contracts for Indigenous businesses there, primarily in the private sector. In fact, they've exceeded a lot of the procurement targets, and that has a lot to do with Supply Nation. So we're now taking steps here to have a business plan completed for an entity here in Canada, which we think, based on the same similar model. We believe that there's value in and possible global branding to assist companies to support and acquire goods and services from Indigenous businesses globally. And there's also an interest from Indigenous people from other countries in coming together with a similar brand and concept. So one of the most important features of such an entity is that it will certify Indigenous businesses. In doing this, we currently have a group of people who will be working on the definition of an Indigenous business in Canada, as this is critical to the process of procurement. We believe it's critically important that Indigenous people develop this definition. You know, unfortunately today, there are businesses that have taken advantage of procurement opportunities and set-asides for Indigenous people. You know, unfortunately, there's shell companies, or sometimes, you know, I come across this individuals professing to be Indigenous, and in order to access some of the contracts out there. So we really want to see the social and economic benefits go to the Indigenous people, the Indigenous communities. And so this is really an important step, I think, in addressing this need. But with a certification process that is agreed upon by Indigenous people, at companies and governments who are looking to procure Indigenous businesses from the database will have the assurance that they're indeed contracting an Indigenous business. There's also going to be a process of continuous recertification as companies change or wind down. It will also help measure whether or not procurement targets are being met. But I think for sure this entity will be a source of information and supports to Indigenous businesses as well. So stay tuned as this initiative progresses over 2021.
We absolutely will, and hopefully we'll have you back at the end of 2021 for another exciting update. I'm mindful that we've got, like, you know, 5-6 minutes left here, and I didn't want to leave without really diving in on infrastructure. I think each of you have like a really unique and important perspective on the role that plays in building lasting partnerships with Indigenous communities and in industry. Tanis, you've already touched on it a little bit, but I'm hoping that we can dive in just a little bit further. You know, how can infrastructure, which as we know is going to be really central to recovery efforts and a lot of spending efforts that are coming down the pipe, how can infrastructure play a role in facilitating good partnerships between industry and communities?
Okay, well, thank you. So yeah, I did already touch on the infrastructure piece a little bit, and going into the relationships that we need to maintain and continually work on to maintain the service. So our passenger service, that portion of our business is subsidized by Transport Canada. And so we not only need to continue that great relationship that we have with Transport Canada in that facet, I really want to step forward and work in other areas, because as I had mentioned about the essential services of just the goods and whatnot, we need to reinvest a lot. Coming up, we need to reinvest a lot, or invest a lot into the track, into the equipment that we have. Which will create new relationships all across the board, in order to get the work done. And interesting enough, you know, talking about partnerships and work relationships, being a railway, again, I think actually Minister Miller was touching on this too. We can't necessarily just stay in our own communities either. We need to be working with all of the railways that are across North America in order to learn best practices and to continuously improve the quality of our services. So that partnership is also very, very important to work with, and we can give back as well. If we look at the North American rail industry, we're uniquely, the climate conditions are just treacherous. It does exist in a couple other places, but not that many. So even there's a benefit that can go worldwide through what we can offer as learning experiences, partnering with academia and those partners as well.
That's great. Dawn, I'll bring you in. Thoughts on infrastructure's important role here.
Mm-hmm. When we speak about infrastructure, I believe it's vitally important to recognize the importance of institutional infrastructure. In this respect, I'm referring to Indigenous owned and controlled institutions. This is one of the recommendations in the first ever OECD report on Indigenous economic development. That was, in the whole history of that international organization. So this is one of the recommendations about institutional infrastructure for Indigenous people. And this concept is similar to the Center of Excellence for Indigenous Minerals Development that I referred to earlier, where this institution is information clearinghouse so that Indigenous communities and our people can find information they need to make a good decision. Or, it's also similar to the existing National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association, who helps Indigenous financial institutions to share leading practices on lending on reserve or managing their loan portfolios. Or the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, who builds relationships and understanding between Indigenous businesses and corporate Canada. These institutions are centers of knowledge, leading practices, research, databases that help build Indigenous capacity. We need these types of institutions in every sector to keep on top of leading practices so that we're not reinventing the wheel every time we do something. Instead, we would be building on success, for example, the Clearwater business success. People generally don't know what they don't know. So these institutions would be a way to mitigate risks and be preventative in terms of avoiding the track of making the same mistakes over and over. We need such institutions for physical infrastructure, for food security, for lands management, for energy, STEM programming. I really think that having Indigenous people, government, and corporate Canada involved can play a role in supporting this Indigenous institutional development. And I think it's really key when we talk about infrastructure.
Dawn, I love the idea of institutional infrastructure. I think that's just such a great frame to bring into this conversation. I think that's really important and something that we could probably build more on as we extend into 2021. So I'm going to call you. We'll talk. Clayton, I'm going to give last word to you. Maybe tie a couple of these thoughts together and bring us home on the idea of infrastructure and partnerships.
All right, I'll give it a go, Alex. As I listened to what Dawn and Tanis had to say, you really see the importance of infrastructure, right? Whether it's the basic needs or it's providing opportunity. But for businesses like IOC, where we have a big infrastructure base, what it does is it creates that opportunity, whether that's through procurement, whether it's through jobs, whether it's through the partnership like we have with the Tuition Railway, where we do some maintenance, they do some, and we share ideas, even share some parts at times. But I think that's the role, is how do we unlock that infrastructure to create opportunity? To me, it's not just about the roads or the railways or the power lines. What there also needs to be is some social infrastructure put in place. And as we build that social infrastructure, it allows us then to connect to the physicals that open up those doors, that create opportunities. And once we have opportunities, that's where I think the real work and change, and I really want to emphasize change, that's where change begins. If we don't ever open up those doors, if we don't unlock that opportunity, we'll continue down the path that we've been on, which I think we all agree is an acceptable path. So I think my challenge to everybody on the call today is, what are you doing to help unlock or open the door? And as we work together to open those doors, we have the infrastructure in place. We've got a great country. There's plenty of opportunity. It's how do we do that? And I think maybe I'll change it slightly and say, how do we put some social infrastructure in place to help unlock the physical so that we can continue to move forward? And as I said earlier, I think that all gets back to trust, respect, and understanding. And I think one thing we've been trying to do in our business is really create a better understanding. You know, we now have a mandatory cultural awareness training, and it's really to help understand the culture and the history of these different groups that we interact with, so we get a perspective on where they're coming from, what they see. And as we see that, we can then help unlock some of these doors to create those opportunities. And I'm just a big believer in, if you give people opportunity, they're going to take it and good things are going to happen. And that's a role we all have to play. So Alex, I think that's, I guess my challenge to everyone is, what are you doing to unlock a door for one of these groups?
That's a perfect way to end it. I would say, Clayton, stuck the landing there on this conversation for us. I really appreciate it. Like I said, there's a lot to follow up here. I think that there's obviously more for us to dive in than 25 minutes allows us to do, as we all know. But I really, really appreciate your time, all three of you. Dawn, it was great to hear an update on how the center is going, and Clayton and Tanis, your unique roles in the ecosystem here. Like I said, we'll talk, because I think there's more work to be done here. So Damadabi Leash, Clayton Walker, Tanis Peterson, I really want to thank you very much for your time today. Miigwech.
Thank you, Alex.
I'm now, thank you. Thank you,
Clayton.
So I'm now going to bring in, who I believe we have on the line here, Crystal Smith, the Chief Counselor of the Haisla Nation, and Susanna Pierce, Director of Corporate Affairs at LNG Canada. Crystal, there you are. I can see you, which is great. And there's Susanna as well. Hi, how are you doing? It's good to see you both. We are going to go for, I think, about 20-ish minutes here. And I think that maybe what I might want to do is just do a quick level set here, because this is not the first time that we've had a chance to connect and speak. Both yourself, Crystal, and Susanna played a role in an event that Canada 2020 did shortly after the announcement of the LNG project. And I think that's kind of what we wanted to talk about today, because it was a historic project when it was announced, and it's certainly I think been held up as a real example of what success looks like. But for people who are on the call that need a bit of a primer on that, on sort of the short history of how the relationship developed and how the project came to be, can I go to you, Susanna, first? Can you just give us a quick history on how it started off and where we are right now?
Sure, happy to do so. And let me just check the mic. Can folks hear me okay? Okay.
Yep, you're great.
Excellent.
You're great.
Fantastic. Well, I'm actually dialing in from the traditional territory, the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. I'm in downtown Vancouver in my office today, which is an unusual thing simply because many folks are working from home. But the bandwidth is a little bit better here, so I thought I'd give it a shot. And, the relationship with the Haisla began many years ago, really. I mean, I think it's almost 12 years ago, Crystal, if we think back. And the LNG Canada project, just for context as well, is a large LNG export facility. So it would essentially chill natural gas and then export it really in large volumes for the first time to some pretty hungry markets overseas in Asia. And these markets are hungry for gas because they're really trying to back out coal as they build up their renewables. And so as a result of that, one of the best locations in order to build a facility like this, to export it, happens to be on the west coast of British Columbia. And in fact, one of the best locations to build a facility like this and export gas just happens to be on the traditional territory of the Haisla First Nation. And so probably 12 years ago or more, I've been with the project 7.5 years, there was a site team that went up all the way up and down the BC coast, and they arrived at the port of Kitimat. And it really was one of the best places, as I mentioned, to look at building this large LNG facility. But one of the first things I think the site team realized is that we can't just think about doing this on our own. we need to have conversations with the Haisla First Nation. And the Haisla have had quite a bit of experience over the years with industrial development. I'll let Crystal speak to that. But I think it was one of those original decisions that we can't move forward without involving Indigenous people, the Haisla First Nation, in early conversations that began the interaction. And we can get into this a little bit about how that all went, because it's not all easy and it wasn't all perfect. And there were moments where I think, and we can reflect back, that Ellis Ross, among others, were not happy. And so we needed to find our way. But I think as a result of these early engagements and over the ups and downs of the project development, I think we've built a really strong relationship. And as that type of relationship, your willingness to be transparent and have hard conversations, but still get through it, that I think has allowed this relationship to persist. So that's maybe a little bit of the context to get us started.
Crystal, I'll go to you. What's obviously, I think Susanna makes it very clear that, early conversations with yourself and the Haisla were really key. Chart the history from your perspective and from the Haislas, because I think it's what's so integral about the success of this project.
And I think, as Susanna alluded to, first of all, sorry about that. Good morning, everybody. I'm coming streamed from my home on our traditional territory of the Haisla people. As Susanna alluded to, the relationship definitely is not one that's made of perfection. There have been ups and downs, and I always like telling the story of when LNG Canada first came to Kitimat. I was actually Ellis Ross's assistant at the time, and I had just returned to work from taking a leave to go back to school, and it was literally my first day. And a Shell representative had shown up at our office, and I was told, "I'm not here." And I'm like, you're sitting right here. And he said, "I'm not here. I do not want, I'm not talking to them just at this point." So it didn't start out in a perfect sense of that relationship. So in turn, over time, we definitely developed and took the approach of doing the hard work to develop that solid relationship that we see today. And I believe that working on the hard aspects of these discussions have led to the success that LNG Canada has had in our territory, but also the success that we have had today.
And so let's talk about the journey. 2 years ago, where was the sort of the final investment decision was made, and we're now 2 years into construction. Susanna, how has the relationship evolved, and what can you tell us about, I guess, what the focus areas are for both parties right now?
Yeah, happy to do that, Alex. But I wonder, in some ways it's easier to ask Crystal, because again, we are on her traditional territory, and I wonder it's in many ways more important about how she thinks the relationship is going, because it really comes down to making sure that the people in the community and in the nation are comfortable with us. So, Crystal, you want to go first, or would you like me to kick off?
Sure, I can take a stab at this one for sure. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate that. Again, Susanna makes a huge point when it comes to involving the discussion where it comes to right down to our people and how they see and how they view our success within our economies that exist within our territory. And I'm so proud to say that, if you want to work, you're working. The opportunities are so vast right now for our people and anybody within our territory, our neighboring First Nations, to be able to have that opportunity. It extends past our Haisla, our people. So when it comes to this success, I think that when you have opportunities for employment, it changes the entire landscape of homes and families within our communities. It provides role models that not only exist, these benefits are, and the success isn't only going to be for today. We're creating role models today for our future generations that is essentially breaking cycles. And us as the elected leadership have an agreement with one of our local banks when it comes to providing mortgages on reserve. And it's not an easy task to have a mortgage on reserve simply because we do not own our land. And so as the council, we have to co-sign essentially for our members when it comes to mortgages. And I've been on council for 7 years. And this year is the most mortgages I've ever seen come across our table. And that makes me very, very emotional because we're creating that independence with our people. And it's opportunities that LNG Canada has provided, but also what we're able to provide in terms of that capacity training in changing our people's lives today.
Crystal, when you joined us in the event in 2018, first off, you joined us actually by video conference. You were an early adopter of the Zoom culture that we now have. So thank you for that. But I do recall you speaking to some of those themes. And when you were speaking, the room, Susanna, I think maybe you can attest to this. When Crystal was speaking, you could hear a pin drop in the room, just in terms of the power of the opportunity and what's at stake here. And so I want to thank you for providing actually an update to some of those, I think, planks. Susanna, I do want to bring you in, and you can build off of what Crystal talked about. I mean, but I also am curious about how you think this project and this initiative fits into the what we're going to sort of broadly call the recovery conversation. Right now, and we are in a moment of crisis. It's a public health crisis and sort of a nesting doll of other crises within it. Can you talk to me a little bit about the importance of this project in both provincial and national recovery efforts? And then maybe we can sort of bring Crystal in on some sort of Heisel specific thing. Can you build on that?
Yeah. Happy to do that. And let me just also reflect back on that last time with Crystal. Yeah, you heard a pin drop because Crystal made a very good point. And I think it's a point that I think we all have to recognize is that the best people to speak for Indigenous people are Indigenous people. And I think Crystal's point was there are many people who like to think they speak for them, but you ought not to speak for people about their interests who aren't from that nation. So in other words, Crystal made the point that if you want to understand what's the best thing for my nation, come talk to people in my nation. And I have a hard time hearing it at that point in time. There were a lot of people who were trying to say what's in the best interest for the Haisla First Nation. And I think Crystal made a very valid point. No, the best interest in the Haisla First Nation is up to the Haisla First Nation. And so when it comes to the decisions that the Haisla made with respect to this project, and again, it's a decision for us to work together to build it and then to operate it. You know, one of the things that, you know, I'm pleased to see, and frankly, every day I wake up and want to see more of, as Crystal mentioned, is a level of Indigenous employment on site. At the end of September, I think we had on the order of, let me just see here, we had about 3,765 folks working around site, just at LNG Canada. About 7% of that, you know, are Indigenous. So that's more than obviously the Indigenous population on a percentage basis in Canada, but that number we want to keep seeing increase. As Crystal said, anyone who wants to work is working. Well, now we want to see people continuing to work over the life of the project, from construction into operations, and continuing to work either directly on the project, or I think as this previous panel just said, which I'm really excited about, having the opportunities and the contracts for an ongoing relationship on that basis as well, because I think there's huge opportunity for that as well. And I think we who are in the decision-making capacity of contracting and procurement need to really build in how we do that so that that doesn't become an afterthought and an oversight. But again, from the numbers perspective, I think we've seen really good employment. From an overall economic recovery perspective, there was a report that came out about a month ago by BC, and Ken Peacock, who's an economist there, who reflected on the fact that without the large capital projects like LNG Canada, Site C, and then the Coastal GasLink project, the BC economy would have stalled last year. There were 1% growth. It was at about 2.7% growth, which is more than the federal growth rate for the year. So I think what we're seeing is it's generating a lot of economic activity, not just direct employment, but certainly throughout the province and then more broadly. And that, I think, when you think about how do we dig ourselves out of sort of our challenge right now from a deficit and debt perspective, we need to take a look at what types of projects can do the kind of economic development that projects like LNG Canada are delivering. So it shouldn't be growth at any cost, but it should be growth that enables development, employment, contracting, and procurement across the population with Indigenous people and with their support. That's the type of economic recovery that I think we really need to be zeroing in on, because it is growing the size of the pie instead of trying to take more out of the same size pie. That's how I think we help inspire economic recovery. By the same time, we also help to build the opportunity for Indigenous people. So it's that type of exciting thing that I think stands before us, but we have to go after it. Because the other thing we can't forget is that there's every other nation in the world that's looking at economic recovery. We compete with these nations. So we need to be resolute, we need to be deliberate, and we need to move.
Crystal, did you want to build on that at all? Because I think there's some pretty crucial stuff in there around the unique role of what makes this project special. Any sort of thoughts on sort of the recovery efforts and the elements of this project?
I think Susanna alluded to in her comment around the inclusion of First Nations participation within that. I think that was one of the highlights through LNG Canada and our relationship, is that a lot of, and when you go back, Susanna reminded me about which conversation I did through Zoom for you last year. And it goes to speak to that volume where there's that environmental aspect is completely taken out of context and completely forgotten, where people feel that they can speak for Haisla when it comes to our environment, to our territory, is that we were actively involved in all the decisions, and LNG Canada was open, transparent. We actually have a process in between our two entities where, we develop the packages, the permit applications together. And I think that has always been forgotten, or not even asked actually, when it came to our input into this project. So I think that is a key aspect in success, but it also speaks to, we're not gonna recover our economy at any stake when it comes to First Nations territories. That is going to be a huge important aspect moving forward. And as Susanna reminded me, I just wanted to go back to our previous the previous question. At that point in time, I was actually getting quite a bit of backlash through social media and on every entity, where I was actually getting private messages from other First Nations people, and in calling me a sellout, calling me an apple, saying that I was the pretty much the description of colonized Indigenous woman. And today, when you talk about 2 years later into the construction phase and what it's brought to our community, I just want to speak about the culture and language programs that we've been able to implement, and the many programs that we're able to implement to meet the needs of our people, where there's nobody telling us you need to do it this way. There's no dictatorship telling us exactly how we provide programs and services to our people. So when my twin sister can speak to me in our language because of programs that we've been able to implement, that honestly, it makes me so emotional and so proud of the work that we're doing here in our community. So I just wanted to, I think that was a huge important aspect that I really needed to mention today.
I really appreciate that. I think that grounding some of these conversations in something very real and tangible and on the ground, I think it really matters. I think it gives much needed context for why sort of the ancillary benefits of projects like this. The other thing, Crystal, obviously I want to acknowledge too, I mean, that you and I are able to talk like this right now. I mean, it's a testament to, I think, some of the, not as quickly as we would like to, but the closing of the broadband gap and connecting Indigenous communities. I think that makes a huge difference in obviously being able to lift up your voice and your community's perspective right now. We've only got a couple minutes left, and I think I want to get at sort of the nub of obviously what makes this project special is, okay, what can we learn from it, and how can we apply it, and how can other communities and companies who want to take a new approach, what can they do? So maybe Susanna, I'll start with you, and then we can end with Crystal. Maybe talk about what you think the learnings are, and how it can be applied a little bit more broadly.
Okay, well, I'll do my best. And again, I always like to start with Crystal because, again, at the end of the day, it's truly what's important and matters to Crystal and her nation in order for this relationship to be successful, because we need to, again, recognize the values and the important things that the Haisla Nation would like to pursue through a project, because it is their traditional territory. So we want to move forward and must move forward with their support and partnership. But again, I think is where we started. It really has to start with, and I think some of your other panelists earlier in the day said this, it really has to start with the conversation that is nothing more than a getting to know each other, getting to build the trust, not asking for anything, being able to be comfortable in a journey of learning about how we can co-develop a project that can be acceptable. And starts at the very earliest stages, like I mentioned, right from site selection. It doesn't start at environmental permitting. It doesn't start at construction. It starts way at the beginning. And I think, today that's hopefully common sense. But I think if you don't do that, then that's a problem. But then I think it's, as I also mentioned, and we mentioned together, that it's not easy. Like, we are going to disagree. We're going to find ourselves probably not agreeing on some various different aspects, but being willing to sit down at the table to try to find the understanding and the position, and then being able to work through something that could be a solution is really what it takes. And it's actually a shared set of values and commitments to achieve something. And I think with respect to LNG Canada and the Haisla First Nation, I think we share those values to achieve something pretty powerful and pretty great. And so that when you have like a marriage, like when you have the squabbles, it doesn't end the marriage. You realize the power of the marriage is so important, and the purpose of it, that you keep going. You find ways of working through it. And so I guess I just say that what makes it work is like any strong relationship, you keep working at it.
Crystal, last word to yourself.
I think Susanna nailed it perfectly. I mean, on the final investment decision celebrations, I'd constantly in my discussions with not only LNG Canada's team of Mike Eddy, Susanna Pearson, and Andy Calitz, and talking about how important this relationship was, but also to their investors, to their board, was that on the final investment decision, I think we got married. And it was going to be that focus of working through all these, and those hard discussions have not stopped. Just because the construction has started and it's being built, those hard discussions continuously happen between both of our two entities. So it's continuously working on it and putting that effort in. I think it's aligning, and LNG Canada did it perfectly in terms of finding out what was important to Haisla when it came to our culture, to our territory, but also to our future, and where we saw our people in, say, 5 to 10 years. And through the construction phase, through the building it up to FID, and then the construction phase, we're not new to having people like Andy Calitz, Mike Eddy, and Susanna, unfortunately, leave at a certain stage within a project. I think what is important, and I think what they've done a really excellent job at, is also having people that come into those and replace those key players, is having those same values felt through. So Peter Zebedee replacing Andy Calitz, those values are still there. That focus is still there. Having Mike Eddy's replacement have a strong focus on seeing and where we see our people in 10 years, and having that keyed goals when it comes to having our people working for the next 10, 20 years. So I think that is also a key aspect when it comes to those changeovers in this entire process.
I think that's a really fantastic place to end it, because I think it ties together a lot of the themes that have been discussed at the two previous conversations as well, just sort of that connective tissue that is really integral to the success of these projects over time. Crystal Smith, Susanna Pierce, I want to thank you very, very much for joining us today. Early for you, but we really appreciate an update on this project. I think it's pretty special, so we're going to come knocking again and maybe have a conversation in another year. But thank you very much, Crystal and Susanna. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Take care. Okay, I am now very pleased to actually hand things off right now to my good friend Sahir Khan, who is at the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. And Sahir, you are going to steer our final conversation today. And you got a lot to work with, Sahir, because I think the theme of this final conversation is Indigenous participation in major projects. We've scratched at the surface of it in our conversation with Minister Miller, the update from the Center of Excellence, and as you just heard, obviously a major project with LNG Canada. So you got a lot to work with, and to help you out, you've got a pretty great panel with you've got Nilo Edwards, who is the Executive Director of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. Nilo, hello. You also have Brian McGuigan, the Manager of Aboriginal Policy at the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. Brian, it's good to see you. And Bing Giroux, who is with Sedgwick Consulting. And so Sahir, I'm going to hand things over to you. We're going to go for about 30 or so minutes. And I would ask people if there have been questions in the chat about this topic in particular. I will do my best to get those to you, Sahir. But if there are people watching that want to ask stuff specifically, again, just drop it in the Q&A function or on the chat online. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Sahir, over to you.
Alec, thanks so much for this. This is actually, I think we were kind of excited planning this this session, because I think we're going to get as gritty as people are going to want in terms of the details. On kind of three dimensions. I'm going to ask our esteemed panelists to kind of help us with three things. We're at this kind of watershed moment in reconciliation, and there's an opportunity to switch from a paradigm of consultation to one of economic engagement. And our experts here, I think, are going to help us do that on three dimensions. We're going to ask them to talk about opportunities, and ask them to talk about impediments to those opportunities. And then the last kind of phase is the solutions. Like, where do we go from here? What can we do very tangibly? And it's kind of an important moment because we're heading into a federal budget, likely in the spring, late winter, and every opportunity for these ideas to be part of that discussion to kind of not only help First Nations communities kind of recover from the pandemic and the recession, but all of Canada. And so this is kind of the scale of opportunities I've heard from Bing, Nilo, and Brian that have been discussed today. So first of all, I'll repeat Alex's thanks for your participation. Very fortunate to have you here. But I'd like to ask each of you to kind of talk about the opportunities, both what you see in terms of the future of what's there in front of us, and kind of what we might be actually missing out on because we're not dealing with all the impediments. But I'll start with first the opportunities. What's out there? Neil, should we start with you?
Thanks, Sahir, and good morning from the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh. Certainly for our members of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, we're over 70 members strong in 6 provinces and territories. We have $7 billion of projects that we're currently involved in and helping our communities assess the opportunity to participate as equity owners in. So I'm going to start there. There's a variety of different asset classes we deal with, including hydroelectric generation, electricity transmission, LNG pipelines. We're getting requests to get involved in all-season roads into northern communities. So as I see it here, there's sort of a dynamic a shift in between a focus of the traditional natural resource sectors of mining, natural gas, oil and gas, and an emerging opportunity in the renewable sector, green technology, net zero initiatives, including in electrification. And I think electrification is a huge opportunity, particularly in Western Canada, for Indigenous communities to lead and become owners in. As we see governments move towards policy that will require proponents who propose industrial projects to move towards electrification, there's going to be a greater need for transmission infrastructure, for generation projects. All of these assets cross Indigenous traditional territory. And so we're working to ensure that our members have the tools and expertise to make informed business decisions about their ability to participate in these assets as equity owners. That in a broad scan is the opportunities as I see them.
And I think interesting that some of these, many of these are actually lining up with economic objectives of the federal government outlined in the last fiscal and economic statement. So there is no conflict here in terms of agendas. We're looking at unlocking opportunities that are directionally useful for all parties. Bing, I'll ask you maybe next to kind of talk about the opportunities here before us and why it's important to kind of unlock these opportunities, both for First Nation and for Canada as a whole.
Thanks, Zahir. I'm also calling from Coast Salish territory. I'm a stone's throw away from Tawasan Nation, which was the first modern urban treaty. So Haishka for having me. Yeah, this is the next horizon. I see this. 20, 30, 40 years ago, Indigenous communities weren't even in the room. Then we started doing impact benefit agreements, and First Nations were seeing at least some of the benefit of projects in their territories. Now we're seeing an interest in equity and ownership, and companies are offering those things. But that is the next horizon. How do we enable Indigenous communities to actually take ownership? And we're seeing phenomena emerge to help this. We see the AIOC in Alberta, the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, but there's still a huge challenge. There are programs for small businesses that want to get involved. And sometimes governments are really interested when it's a huge project like TMX. But in between that, there is very little access to capital for First Nations to get in at the right stage of what I call the risk curve. Getting people involved, whether it's Indigenous communities or other investors, after you finish construction or during construction, when the risk is diminished, that's easy. But if you want to get Indigenous communities involved much earlier, where they have a say in design and a say in how the project will be rolled out, so if they can help enable a project, which I think is something we all want to work towards, you're going to have to bring Indigenous community participation and ownership further up that risk curve. And frankly, that's something that Nilo and his organization is dealing with. And it's a huge, huge challenge. We need, frankly, to move from consultation to consensus and from accommodation to partnership. And the only way we're going to do that is if Indigenous communities are actually owning the levers of economic power and getting that economic reconciliation in their communities. So what I'm excited about is that there's an interest, and I'm hearing it, in government and in industry and organizations like Nilo's. How can we help Indigenous communities get, frankly, let's be very specific, access to cheap capital, so they can actually get a return on an investment? They need to be able to borrow at a rate that makes sense for them to invest. And right now, we're seeing, maybe this is systemic racism, maybe it's just the nature of banking. First Nations are not able to get access to capital at a decent rate in order for them to make those kinds of investments and see a legitimate return that's actually going to see some return that's going to help benefit their community. So I see this as a real opportunity. This is the next horizon, but we got to get over that horizon.
And so, Bing, I think what you're articulating is very much that idea that consultation, when maybe it's not meaningful or you're just trying to tick a box, is very different from meaningful economic participation and engagement. I think the other point I find particularly compelling what you're saying is that when that engagement takes place matters. The level of risk being assumed also matters, because there are rewards associated with risk being taken at an earlier phase of the project. And that also helps to define moving from mere consultation to engagement. Brian, I'm going to turn to you, Brian. And by the way, I think you've set up that the next round we'll talk about the really gritty impediments that are in place, and love to hear each of you kind of talk about the on the ground, what's really happening. And Brian, I want to have you kind of close the section on opportunities, what we're missing by not engaging the right way.
Thanks, Sahir, and it's great. Good morning, everybody. I'm talking to you from Calgary this morning. I'm in the Treaty 7 territory and also Region 3 of the Métis Nation of Alberta. It's a snowy, wintry morning this morning. We've finally broken our unfortunate warm spell, broken the spell. You know, it's interesting. I was thinking about this morning before we started, and I was going to go almost exactly where Bing went and talking about, I think, stages of development in terms of how industry, Indigenous relationships have evolved over the last 20 years or so. And so here, when you talked about moving from consultation to engagement, I guess what I see is, yeah, consultation. I think one of the stages that we moved into in the early 2000s was consultation and deeper consultation and deeper consultation. That led to economic opportunity for communities. And that started the business conversations between the resource sectors generally and Indigenous communities. I'll throw some quick numbers out for you. Oil sands companies between 2013 and 2016 procured on average $1.8 billion per year from Indigenous owned companies. Compare that to the entire federal government, just to put it into context. I think the entire federal government procurement in that same period was just under $150 million. So really significant economic opportunities arising from resource development there. Indigenous companies are 40 times more likely to engage in the natural resource sector than they are in other sectors of the Canadian economy. Employment, interestingly, Susanna's number was, I think she said it was 7% for their project. For our sector, for oil and gas, it's about 6% across the whole sector of people, of employees who self-identify. So we're seeing, there's a study done by Ken Coates a couple of years ago of engagement between oil and gas and Indigenous people. And what he identified then was procurement is king. Yeah, we all do the consultation process, but really it's the business opportunities and it's the procurement opportunities that come with development. One of the things, somebody else earlier this morning talked about the nested dolls of our crisis that we're in right now. Our sector is in kind of a double whammy. We feel like we're in the kind of the smallest of those nested dolls at the bottom of that crisis. But the Indian Resource Council, the First Nations who are members of the Indian Resource Council, have seen their royalties drop in the last year about 95%. Drop in royalties from oil and gas production on reserve. So there is a real challenge right now. The opportunities are there. And I think where we are starting to see the movement, obviously, is toward economic inclusion, like Bing talked about, moving into equity participation in projects. So some quick examples for people of places where we've seen engagement in the natural resource sector. Mi'kmaq First Nations buying 50% of Clearwater Seafoods, for example. I would include the fishery as a natural resource extraction. Natural Law Group, 5 Cree First Nations from Saskatchewan taking a $1 billion position in the KXL pipeline. Fort Mackay, the Mikisew Cree, buying about just under 50% of a tank farm for $500 million. All of those, I think all of those are privately financed positions, but it is a challenge to be able to put together the financing for those kinds of acquisitions. And I think that has been the challenge, is how do we manage to get the financing in place to get those transactions to happen so First Nations can start involving themselves in the Canadian economy in a real way, and you start to see the changes that Crystal Smith talked about when she was talking so passionately, the changes in people's lives.
Brian, I think that's a really good jump off point, because I think you've highlighted some of the impediments that are preventing us from kind of, in First Nations communities, accessing those benefits and those opportunities. Okay. And on multiple dimensions, right? We're talking about financing. We've talked about in our pre-chat about capacity. I'd like maybe Brian, we'll start with you just to talk about specifically the impediments and how they actually stop progress, how they limit the type of engagement that would be meaningful on an economic basis for First Nations communities. And I think that's good, and to be as vivid as we can about those so that they're not theoretical or conceptual, but these are what actually stops these projects from happening.
Okay, and I can say, you know what, I can speak to those from my experience being involved in negotiating IBAs and that kind of work before I came to CAP. I can speak to it from my experience of working within the industry now. And I think it's really important to hear it from people like Crystal Smith who are in the communities and see the real challenges. But this is my perspective on it, is that I think I largely see two sets of challenges. One is the access to capital, one that Bing has already started to talk about. So how do you access capital in a timely way and in a way that makes projects competitive and sustainable? The other area of challenge that I see is around the business capacity. How do we develop capacity to be able to make decisions, business decisions, in a smart and timely manner so that First Nations and other Indigenous groups can participate in the business opportunities? I've worked with one of our member companies who has spent about 10 years helping a First Nation to develop one of their businesses. So that business went from being the junior partner in a JV on a subcontract in a big project. 10 years later, that company was strong enough that they bid on a major contract on their own and won the bid. So it's that long-term relationship that enables business capacity to develop. How do you make those decisions? How do you build the business? How do you have that long-term horizon that's longer than, you know, say a 4-year election cycle? You need to be able to have that long-term horizon and to be able to make the decisions and have a decision-making process that is insulated from community politics. So you have we talked about, we need to separate business and politics. This is one of those places where you need to have a business decision-making process that's insulated. I'll just make a little bit of a comment here. One of the trends that I've seen in the last 5 years that has been so encouraging is, and I mentioned at the beginning, this is just my perspective. Indigenous people need to speak about what they need. But one of the things that I've really seen that I think is really encouraging is the development of Indigenous-led organizations that are focused on trying to build these capacities. NILO's organization is a leader of all of those, I think. We also see groups like the Indian Resource Council. They've been around for a long time, but they've shifted their focus in the last few years. The National Chiefs Coalition has the same kind of a focus on how do we develop businesses. The Indigenous Resource Network, Canadian Council on Aboriginal Business is another example. So all of those organizations will be really helpful, but it's an interesting dynamic that we're seeing those sorts of organizations get off the ground and be successful, and they're obviously answering a need in Indigenous communities. I'll leave it there.
Brian has given us actually two really good jump-off points here. Nilo, I want to head off the capacity, which is near and dear to your heart, that capacity building issue, as how that's the capacity itself is an impediment. And then Bing, I'll ask you to, after Nilo's gone through it, talk about the financing impediment that you highlighted at the beginning, teased us a bit, but I'd like to kind of have you elaborate on that as well. So we'll start with Nilo on capacity and how that impediment or removal of impediment is absolutely critical to the nature of engagement, and all the way to co-development, as one of our attendees has texted in.
So here you might have to get your hook ready to stop me here, because I might go on too long on this point. But anyway, here I go. So I think the important thing to recognize here is capacity across the board in our member communities is incredibly imbalanced. You have folks who have familiarity with doing business deals with proponents all the time, and then you have communities, for no fault of their own, it gets back to a number of different impediments, and really I'm going to say it, the history of colonialism in this country that has caused a lot of it, where the capacity isn't where it should be. And the communities have, taken steps to join organizations like ours to get extra help in bringing that up to a level playing field. These projects that we deal with are complex. They're challenging projects. They consist of regulatory processes, tight timelines, competitive capital, everything that First Nations don't have to be successful. So, for the majority of our members, we're starting at a disadvantage. And I think this is a very important gap to recognize as we get into an era where now the federal government has introduced legislation around UNDRIP. Thinking about UNDRIP in a business capacity sense. Our organization, the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, is dedicated to ensuring our members have the tools to make free, prior, and informed business decisions about resource development. This means getting in on the ground level of development, being able to be the proponent yourself at times, but at times when that's not possible, being able to walk with the proponent right from the start. And Bing talked about, you know, further down the risk curve. Well, we want to be at the start of that risk curve and to work with the proponent to design a deal that community members can see their values reflected back at them in. That's what we're driving towards here. And there's many challenges in the way, but there's also many opportunities. And, you know, 10 times out of 10, done right, the opportunities are going to outweigh the challenges. We need to be able to design a system here in this country that recognizes the importance, the true importance of meaningful partnerships with Indigenous communities on the development within their traditional territories. This means addressing capacity. It also means addressing development costs. First Nations do not have access generally to the dollars that have to be put most at risk for development. They are often beholden to proponents and proponents' data under which to make their decisions. That's not making an independent decision. First Nations have to be empowered to make their own decisions. They need the resourcing in order to do it. And, you know, I think it's incumbent upon organizations like ours to work with different levels of government and proponents to find solutions to these challenges, and we're doing that today. The last thing I'm going to say is there's also a tendency on the side of proponents to design their business strategy around reducing risk to themselves. And that often means, you know, what's good for the proponent, not necessarily what's good for the Indigenous community. A lot of deals are designed to maximize benefits for shareholders, not necessarily maximize social benefits for communities. And as we get into the era of UNDRIP and free, prior, and informed decisions, corporate Canada has to reevaluate those strategies so that they align appropriately with the values of Indigenous communities.
Bing, if Nilo's even more successful than he is now when he starts to help address capacity issues, building confidence in First Nations communities to do these deals, to be at the earlier part of the cycle, to get bigger shares of these projects, to be able to get better benefits on the social and other dimensions. They can't do that if they can't get the financing. So can you take us through this very real obstacle that we have right now, impediment in realizing these opportunities?
You know, Nilo's hit on it already. He's talking about $7 billion of projects. I'm working on a number of projects where this is a very real issue. There is government support for small business, Indigenous business, and sometimes there's support for these massive projects, but there is very little support for everything in between, from 10 million to $500 million or what have you. What's going on here is there is venture capital out there, and people will say, well, why doesn't the private sector just do this? Why does government have to be involved? Because that venture capital doesn't include Indigenous people. So those Indigenous communities want to be involved in the project at the very beginning so they can help design it. That's where we get consensus. Let's talk C69. Let's talk free, prior, and informed consent. How do you get consensus? Well, consensus and free, prior, and informed consent is also an economic decision. So in order for me to get under the hood of a company, it's best that I own a piece of it. So I can see the board minutes, I can see the finances. You need to be involved. And that way you can also design the project to meet some of those things that Nilo just talked about. So not only is it a benefit to shareholders, it's a benefit to the local community. So what do we need? We need access to inexpensive capital. A pipeline will have a rate of return of 9%. Well, that means I have to borrow money, probably less than 6 for me to make it worth my while. Indigenous communities aren't able to find that capital. And so I think this is where economic reconciliation actually does need the government to take a role. How do I provide Indigenous communities a way to participate in projects, frankly, that are a little more risky? But listen, government lends money to other risky ventures. Why not Indigenous people? So they can get involved a little earlier, so they can get involved at a cheaper amount, because capital, getting involved earlier will be less expensive because it's higher risk. So if I can borrow money at 3%, and I'm looking at a 9% return if and when the project is approved and constructed in 3-4 years from now, that's something I can sink my teeth into. And I think as a participant, that's something Indigenous communities can sink their teeth into. And then you're there the whole length of the project, from concept to environmental assessment to design to construction to operation, and it's your project. And those benefits that Nilo talked about that would never typically flow perhaps only to shareholders are also flowing to the community. This cheap money, I can't beat this horse hard enough. This cheap money is the fundamental impediment we are now encountering on Indigenous economic reconciliation. Companies are offering equity, they are entering impact benefits agreements, First Nations are at the table at a government-to-government level, but they still can't get a piece of the pie.
I think that's kind of, I think led us to kind of our last kind of topic here on the solutions. Brian, I'm going to ask you maybe to pick up on Bing's jump off point here, which is the financing and the access to capital and other things that you think kind of lead to solutions to kind of realize opportunities on the terms of First Nations that Nilo articulated, right? And so not just on a commercial basis, meeting all those other tests that are critical to getting long-term buy-in for sustainable projects.
Well, I think, Sahir, I think part of what I would say is a couple of pieces. I think from the industry perspective, I mean, the CEOs that I talk to among our members are clear that major projects won't be built in Canada without Indigenous participation or Indigenous support. So if we're talking about trying to kickstart our economy, finding solutions to enable that participation into the projects is a key piece to that. It's also, I'll just say, this is a piece that a message I really want to deliver today is, and we heard it really clearly from Crystal Smith, but the impact that these projects have in communities is immeasurable. The impact on people's lives. I think of these projects as a kickstart for reconciliation. It's a piece. There's a lot of other tasks that are involved in reconciliation. Righting injustices from the past, resolving historic grievances that need to be addressed. This can happen much more quickly. Changes can be measured in months rather than decades, and it's critical that we move these things forward quickly. Finding these kinds of solutions to both the capacity side and the financing side, I think, are critical to getting change started in Canada. And if we talk about rebuilding better, this is, in my mind, one of the most critical parts of rebuilding better is finding solutions to the challenges that Bing has identified. I don't know if I answered your question here, but I took a run at some messages that I really want to.
You did, because at the IFSC, we've been doing a lot of work with the Assembly First Nation and the Caring Society dealing with reform of the child and family services system, right? And there's so many more Indigenous kids in foster care than you do non-Indigenous kids. And we can look at territories where, across the territory, you'll have economic opportunity in one part of the territory, and their social welfare numbers are so much better. Whereas there's, you're dealing with fundamental poverty issues that are trapping families and their kids in these very, very challenging social circumstances. And so I think we get in this habit of kind of delinking economy and well-being. And the reality is you can't, right?
So here,
go ahead, Bing.
Sorry, just quick. Red Chris Mine in Tahltan territory, I was involved in the IBA on that thing. The Tahltan Nation doesn't have one kid in external care. Tahltan Nation, because of mining in their territory. Not one.
So a quick comment on that. I'll pick up on that. I did some work for the Tahltan as well. And there you've got capacity to make decisions. They've got a really clear governance structure. They can make their business decisions. They've got some best practices around some of those things. And I'm not sure how they've solved some of the access to capital type issues that they've had, but there you've got some strong capacity going on there where they've got process that's in place.
Nilo, I'm gonna. No worries, Brian. Nilo, we're gonna ask you maybe to talk about solutions now, to build on some of the capacity issues you talked about, realizing economic opportunities. We've got to get this in before Alex yanks us out because we're a little over now. But it's hard to stop once we got going. But you're yours to have the final word here.
Well, there's an opportunity, I think, for the public sector, the private sector, and really civil society to work with us on these solutions. Certainly, we are working with government on access to capital. It's going slower than we like. I think the federal government in particular has an opportunity to take a good hard look at the mandate of the Canada Infrastructure Bank and see how it can be designed to really facilitate access to capital to Indigenous people who are looking to partner in projects. We also have the First Nations Finance Authority. It's a great vehicle for access to capital. We're currently working with them. They need to be supported so they can do more deals like the Clearwater Seafoods deal. That's the benchmark that we're looking for. Certainly our members are excited by that. And the other thing that we're getting into that we're going to release is a significant report on the Indigenous worldview around ESG investing principles. And this is a body of research that'll come out from us in January. And I think, as far as the investment community, the project finance sector is concerned, we need to be paying attention to that as Canada moves to implement UNDRIP. Because if ESG investing principles are not aligned with the principles of UNDRIP, we have a serious problem.
Neil, maybe it's a good opportunity for us to maybe make a plug for your conference, March 18th, 19th, 2021, Indigenous Sustainable Investment Conference, that's going to be run by your organization. So we'll ask Alex to kindly send out a link to this event as well. Let people know there are going to be follow-up discussions about this. This isn't the end of it. I'm going to ask each of you maybe, I know we didn't talk about this earlier, but we've got a federal budget coming in the spring, late winter. If there is something that the federal government could do, I want you each to maybe propose a measure that you think will deal with both realizing this opportunity or deal with one of these impediments. But fundamentally, as some of our attendees have been asking about, changing the nature of the dialogue from consultation to engagement. And I'm going to ask each of you one thing that the federal government could do to kind of push this along and make economic reconciliation part of the larger reconciliation agenda. Bing, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, pretty easy one. Repurpose funds that have already been allocated to the Canadian Infrastructure Bank and within Infrastructure Canada, maybe some other places, to a little bit higher risk First Nation equity participation in major industrial infrastructure projects across the country.
Okay. Ryan?
I think I would, well, then I'll try to focus on a different area than that, and I'll go to the capacity piece, and I'd say create programs or supports that are identified through organizations like Major Projects Coalition for helping First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities make clear business decisions and investment decisions. So I don't know what that looks like. It needs Indigenous input into how that program would look.
Because Neil, you've talked about one of the obstacles here being that if there isn't capacity, there isn't confidence. And suspicion will lead to rejection of deals, whether the merits are there or not, but that confidence is actually critical to realizing the opportunities. But I'm going to ask you for your Christmas wish list for the next federal budget.
So a couple of things. There needs to be strategic investments in capacity, particularly coming off the heels of the implementation of the UNDRIP legislation, or the tabling rather. If there isn't sufficient capacity to engage in that conversation, it will not be the success that Indigenous communities are hoping it will be. Second thing I will say is, in order for our economy to grow and recover in the way that we want it to, we have to unlock the wealth that is sitting idle within Indigenous communities and do everything we can to ensure that communities can tap into the wealth that is being generated off of their traditional territories and become economic contributors in a major way, basically get into the mainstream of Canada's economy for the first time in a major way. And that means, as Bing said, access to capital. If you don't have the access to capital, you can't do anything.
And I think it's also worth maybe considering, we learned some things about the COVID pandemic where gaps between have and have-nots were actually exacerbated. So issues like broadband infrastructure, it isn't just economic opportunity, but all the social services, healthcare, education, others that have kept First Nations communities from fully participating in those opportunities could be a major, that's my plug for something I think is going to be very important for the upcoming budgets, to see First Nations infrastructure improved. Water obviously is a critical component to this and well publicized, but without broadband, how do you unlock some of these other opportunities, including the capacity building that Nilo has been highlighting? Nilo, you want to jump in?
So here, you know, there's no better way in this country than to have Indigenous communities self-deliver that infrastructure by harnessing wealth generated from their traditional territories. You know, build their own broadband, build their own houses and roads. This is what I'm hearing from our members across the country, is they want to have the economic means to address their own infrastructure deficit.
And this is what I think Brian highlighted, the fact that you can, if you get First Nation communities engaged as participants on the small projects, they will then be the leads, the prime contractors on the bigger ones down the road. Alex, I think we've hit the time mark pretty closely without having to cut off these fine gentlemen and their expertise.
I was gonna pull the rug earlier, but your last question was just so good, Sahir. I had to hear it through. So thank you very much for doing a fantastic job moderating this discussion. Nilo, Bing, Brian, thank you very much for your time. And I am going to just very quickly walk through what we've got coming up here at 2020 with the Crisis to Resilience series. Before I do that, thank you very much for tuning in. This has been, you know, the graphic for this series has been sort of a topographic map, like, and I think this event in particular really helped provide like a roadmap, both a lay of the land and I think a roadmap for a way forward on these issues. So we really appreciate doing so. I will very quickly, just if you do want to catch up on this series, you can do that across our platforms. I've said, as I said at the top, YouTube, Facebook, or on your favorite podcast app, you can listen to a lot of the conversations that we've had throughout this series. I also, again, want to thank my sustaining partners who help Canada 2020 do what we do. Like I said, conversations like this happen because we have the capacity to do so, and that's thanks in large part to this group of companies here. I also want to give a special thank you to our partners at Rio Tinto and Enbridge, who have been a real close collaborator and a very intentional partner on this conversation. So I want to give thanks to them and their teams. As I mentioned off the top, this is not the final event in this series. That actually will happen next week on Wednesday, December 16th. We are going to be talking about energy transformation. This actually event, if you're tracking it, was scheduled earlier. We've had to postpone it. It will happen next week on the 16th on Wednesday. Minister O'Regan will be joining us, as will the Honourable Anne McClellan, and a really fantastic response panel. We'll have more information on that shortly. That's it for me. I want to thank you all very much for tuning in. If you have feedback, if you have ideas, if you have things that you want to share with us and our team, we're listening. I'm Alex at Canada2020.ca, and we look forward to talking to you again soon. So again, from the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, Miigwech, thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll see you again soon.